Well, I've only been stabbed once. It was by my brother. We were kids in the backseat of the car, and he had a knife that my dad had given him, and I had the seatbelt that was in an old car, you know, where the middle seatbelt was long and you could stretch it out, and then it had that heavy metal tip that if you sort of swing it in a whipping action can cause a lot of pain. So I was whipping him with that, and then he pulled out the knife and poked me in the leg with it, which I couldn't believe. I'm like, you just poked me with the knife? So I whipped him again, and then he stabbed me again, and I whipped him again, and he was like, don't do it again. And I was like, man, don't tell me what to do. Pop, and then he just sunk his knife into my leg, and I remember I was like, ah! And his first response was, shh, don't tell Dad. I'm like, don't tell Dad? I think the pooling blood of my jeans is gonna be a giveaway. But you know, that's a good summary of our childhood. You know, he broke a mirror over my face. I threw his trophies around the room. We did stuff like that. We had a sister too, but you weren't allowed to hit her, so our warfare there was primarily psychological. But the point is we always managed to make up because Mom demanded it, but siblings fight. Brothers and sisters fight, and man, we did it, and many of you that have siblings probably did the same. But here's the thing, just as much as physical brothers and sisters fight, spiritually, brothers and sisters, they fight. You see it in the Bible. You read the book of Acts, and the early church was threatening to split in all these different cities, primarily like ethnically and culturally, Jew and Gentile lines. And there was always this kind of divide that the apostles are pulling back together. You saw in the church of Corinth, Paul wrote 2 letters to the Corinthians begging them to get along. We have a letter from the church fathers right after that where they split as a church. They couldn't figure out how to get along. Then the church split with East and West. And now even if you read the history in Europe, the dirt in Europe is soaked with the blood of people who profess to be Christians murdering other people who profess to be Christians, right? That's part of our history. America's the same. I was a church history major, and I remember I had to read a book called The History of the Church in America and Canada. And the Canadian chapters were so boring because whenever they had a problem, they just kind of talked and then worked it out. Americans, we just killed each other over every problem, even people who claimed to be followers of Jesus. And it's fascinating. I went to what is regarded as a holy site, traditionally as the place where the empty tomb was, where Jesus rose from the dead. There's now a church there in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And you can go in there, and it's a fascinating place. Just a few years ago, police had to come in because different factions of the Christian church will come worship at different times, and there were 2 groups that felt that they were supposed to worship at a certain time. There's literally lines on the floor you're not supposed to cross, and so these monks began to punch and kick each other, and there's a video of a monk that just comes flying from the back. Superman punches another monk, and you're like, what? And it's the craziest thing that you see in this holiest of place where Jesus rose from the grave. His followers are throwing hard shots at each other's face because you worship different than me. Christians fight. It's an embarrassing thing. The 17th century philosopher, Jewish philosopher Spinoza said this: I have often wondered that persons who make a boast of professing the Christian religion, namely love, joy, and peace, temperance, charity to all men, should quarrel with such rancorous animosity and display daily toward one another such bitter hatred. This, rather than the virtues which they profess, is the readiest criteria of their faith. He says, do you want to know a Christian? Watch, they'll be the ones fighting. Which can feel a little unfair. And we can say, well, yeah, that's how it was back in the past, Ben, but we don't do that anymore, right? But it's interesting. I remember a couple years ago, a slew of books came out by what was coined as the new atheists, people who said there is no God. And much of their philosophical arguments were not new and not particularly well articulated, to be quite honest. But one of the things that gave them traction is they constantly went to the hypocrisy of Christians. They proclaim to love a God of peace, and yet they're so cruel to one another. And we see this. I remember when I was in college, whenever the 2 Christian intramural teams would play each other in football, they had extra referees, right? Because there would be more fouls and more cussing than when other teams played each other. Because you're in a different Christian organization with a different verse on your t-shirt, so you got to die, right? And we do that, right? We do that. We fight among each other. There's fights in the world today, and there's fights in here. And he's going to talk about this. It's interesting. James says, what causes the fights and quarrels among you? Did you notice that he assumes they're there? He doesn't say, does anyone ever fight in the church? He was like, all right, y'all are fighting. What causes them? And he asks us to look at the root of them. And I find that interesting. So we're going to talk about that. What causes the fights, right? And here's the thing. I'm talking about it primarily in the church because that's what James is doing here. But everything we're about to say unpacks in other areas of your life. So just try to imagine, some of you maybe deal with this, that there's some disagreements at your workplace. I don't know, anybody? Some of you, maybe there's some fights politically, across political lines, I hear tell. Some of you maybe among your roommates, right? And he's going to ask you what causes these fights. He assumes they're there. And here's what's interesting. He's been talking kind of at the edges of our issues in the book of James. Why do you talk this way to each other? Why do you prefer rich people over poor people? But what he's going to do now in this section, James is going to get to the heart of the whole letter. He's going to say all these issues of how we talk to each other, how we treat people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. He said those are branches. He's going to take us to the trunk of our problem, then the roots of our problem, and then give us the remedy. This is the heart of the letter, all right? So he's going to show us our problem. He's going to show us our problem's roots, and then he's going to give us the remedy. You ready? All right, so the problem, he says, what's the cause of quarrels and what causes fights among you? That's interesting. He's asking it as a question. What's the cause of your quarrels and fights? And it's like he's prompting you to answer. And typically we would answer with, well, it's because Bob is so arrogant, or it's because Susie's always late, or it's because he's a moron, or it's because she's always late. You expect to give an external answer, right? Or a name. And then James flips it. He says, is it not this? Is it not the passions at war within you? And it's interesting that within you is not within you collectively. He uses a singular you there. The Greek language he wrote it in has a you singular and has a y'all, right? So the first one's the y'all. What causes fights among y'all? He says it's the desires, the hedone. It's where we get the word hedonism. It's the selfish desires within you. And so what's interesting about that, he says whatever you think the problem is not the problem. He says what causes the battles among you are the desires within you. The problem's not out here. The problem's in there, right? And so he goes on and says that. Verse 2, you desire and don't have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. And there's a rhythm to the text. You know, he's like, what causes the fights and quarrels? It's your pleasures within you. You desire and you covet, so you fight and you quarrel. And so he's like, what's causing the fights and quarrels? It's your desires. It's you internally. It's something going on within you. What he's saying there is the issue is not the issue. It's how you respond to the issue that's the issue. Let me tell you this. This is a big part of premarital counseling. So those of you who are like, should I get premarital counseling? Here's some for free. Write it down. I talk to so many couples, and they have some issue. Well, her parents keep coming to visit. Well, she wants to spend this amount on flowers and I don't. Well, I want to go here for the honeymoon. She wants to go there. And you go, you know what? It really doesn't matter often what the presenting issue is. It's how you respond to each other when there's friction. It's how you treat each other. And that crisis is an opportunity to figure out how to relate in a healthy way. But the issues always change, but the issue is not the issue. The issue is how you respond to the issue. Your moms did this. When you were beating up your siblings, hey, what are y'all doing in there? Well, she did this, well, he grabbed that, well, he did this. Okay, yeah, I don't care. Get along. Figure out how to get along, right? And what happened? She doesn't care about the stuffed animal. She doesn't care about who ate whose snack. She wants the way you handle the conflict to be healthy, right? So the presenting issue is not the issue. It's your heart in it. There is no issue that necessitates a war among Christians. Let me say that again. There is no issue that necessitates a war among Christians. And yet it can feel that way sometimes. And it can be political, it can be social, it can be theological. I remember, I wasn't there, but the story was famous. At my seminary I went to, there was a discussion in a theology class about Calvinism versus Arminianism, right? Arminianism emphasizes the freedom of human choice. Calvinism emphasizes the sovereignty of God over all decisions. And they were talking about it in class, and different parts of the class started fighting among each other, and it broke out into a fist fight. One guy like hit another guy. These two guys physically started fighting each other over this. Isn't that great? And so it became a debate at school, what you should do to him, right? And the joke among students was, well, you have to punish the Arminian because he had the freedom of choice. You can't punish the Calvinist. He had to hit him, right? And it's a little theology humor. If you missed it, that's probably okay. But Hey, in the past, we would kill each other over stuff like that. But Charles Simeon was a was a pastor in Cambridge in the 1700s, and he met John Wesley. John Wesley, one of the great popularizers of Arminianism. Charles Simeon, one of the greatest preachers of the Calvinist tradition. And this is what Simeon said when he met the Arminian, John Wesley. He said, "Sir, I understand that you're called an Arminian, and I have been sometimes called a Calvinist. Therefore, I suppose we are to draw our daggers. But before I consent to combat, with your permission, I will ask a few questions. Pray, sir, do you feel yourself a depraved creature, so depraved that you have never had a thought of turning to God if God had not first put that into your heart?" Wesley said, "Yes, I do indeed." "And do you utterly despair of recommending yourself to God by anything you can do and look for salvation solely through the blood and righteousness of Christ?" "Yes, solely through Christ." "But sir, supposing you were at first saved by Christ, are you not somehow or other to save yourself afterwards by your own works?" "No, I must be saved by Christ from first to last." "Allowing then that you were first turned by the grace of God, are you not in some other way to keep yourself by your own power?" "No, I'm not." "What then are you to be upheld every hour and every moment by God as much as an infant in a mother's arms?" "Yes, altogether." "And is all your hope in the grace and mercy of God to preserve you into his heavenly kingdom?" "Yes, I have no hope in him, but him." "Then, sir, with your leave, I will put up my dagger again. This is all my Calvinism, my election, my justification, my final perseverance. It is in substance all that I hold as I hold it. Therefore, if you please, instead of searching out terms and phrases to be the ground of contention between us, we will cordially unite in those things where we agree." Isn't that fascinating? Rather than looking for the areas to fight, he was looking for the common ground. Now, that isn't to say we should all pretend there aren't real issues. There are real issues. And theologically, these are serious issues to debate. And some of you have serious policy issues you're debating. Some of you have serious friendship issues you're debating. We need to all kick in for rent. These are serious questions. And yet, they don't necessitate a war. They don't necessitate quarreling, fighting, bickering. They don't necessitate that. Nothing necessitates us to devolve into fighting each other. There's a way towards civility, right? It's interesting. The word quarrel in Greek is actually the word Twitter. Isn't that strange? Just kidding. But, boy, I'll tell you, it's hard to stay on, isn't it? I mean, I look at it sometimes, and basically I followed Twitter to follow the news. Now I just open it up and watch Christians draw daggers. They're looking for ways to fight. And I'm like, this is not a good witness. This is not. We have to have a way to discuss our issues with each other that brings peace. No issue necessitates a war. And so what James will say is, do you know why you're fighting? It's not even about the thing. It's not about theology. It's not about rent. It's not about what you said. It's the desire in you. It's the selfish ambition in you. And you see it sometimes in churches. It's funny. I just ran into this lately as people discuss other churches. It's funny the way it's even discussed in front of me as a pastor, like in town, right? When someone says they go to another church, they kind of whisper it or break eye contact. You know what I mean? Like, well, I actually go to, like they expect me to go, "Oh, really? Okay, if you like inauthentic worship, good luck over there." Like I'm supposed to be. And you run into Christians who do stuff like that. Like it's hard to celebrate. Like when someone says, "Hey, I'm listening to this pastor who's really helping me." How many times do you go, "Oh, that's really great"? Or how many times do you go, "Oh, well, have you heard this guy? Because he's way better. Because I heard your guy. Your guy's lame. This guy's all," and why am I even fighting about that? There's something in us that wants the best, right? And we do it in weird ways about restaurants. "Oh my gosh, you found the best taco." "No, that's not the best taco. The best taco's over here." "No, that's not the best taco. The best taco's over here." "Well, you're dumb. Well, let's go," right? And we fight. Why? Because I want to know the best this. I want to be the best that. I want to be a part of the most awesome this. And your awesomeness is a threat to mine. There's only a little bit of awesome to go around, and I must collect it all for me. There's something selfish in us that fights like this. I want more for me, more for me, more for me. And James will say that's the issue, why we're fighting. The issue is not the issue. The fights come from a selfish desire within. That's what he was saying earlier in chapter 3. I kind of skipped it, but he asked, "Who's wise among you?" And it's funny, he asked it in a way that you would raise your hands, like, "Who's wise?" Right here, right? And before you can answer, he's like, "Well, nope. He says, "Don't tell me, show me. Wisdom shown by good conduct done in humility." And then he talks later about wisdom. Those who sow in righteousness reap a harvest of peace, right? What's he talking about? Well, he's talking like the wisdom literature. In the wisdom literature, God used wisdom to create the world. The way God made the world makes sense. And when the world works together, it creates peace, shalom, everything flourishes. Godly wisdom brings order out of chaos, and then everyone flourishes. Men flourish, women flourish, children flourish. Why? Because we humbly serve one another. And that's why he says, so if you're jealous or you're ambitious, he says, don't boast about that or lie to the truth. He said, watch your heart. You think you're wise? Look at your heart. If there's jealousy in your heart, if there's ambition in your heart, you're not wise. Because the wisdom from above produces peace. He says, but where you see ambition, you'll see every vile practice. He says, it is not from above. It is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. And he's going back to Genesis. When God is in the mix, he takes chaos and he brings order, but not a stifling order, an order that brings peace, lets people flourish. He says, but when you have jealousy, that's from the devil. Because the word devil comes from diablo, to judge through. The devil likes to separate, divide. Let's get Eve away from God. Let's get you away from each other. Let's sow discord between Cain and Abel. Let's rip it apart. And if you let jealousy and ambition stew in your heart, you'll be a divider in the culture. That's what's so dangerous when you're building a church, is this kind of stuff. If you want advice on how to kill a church, James is giving it to you, by the way. So if you're like, man, I really want to destroy Passion City Church, let me tell you how to do it, okay? Here's what you would do. What you want to do is really have a selfish ambition inside. I want to see myself elevated. I want to be a leader around here. I want people to notice me. Who gets to be on stage? When's it my turn? You want to get that selfish ambition just kind of at a low simmer, okay? Just kind of put it on a simmer there, all right? And then what you want to do is you want to look around at other people who have some of the things you want, and you want to just add some jealousy in, okay? Just be like, hey, why do they get to do that? Who does she think she is? Why does she think she's so smart, right? And you just kind of want to let that jealousy kind of simmer in there. And then as it simmers, it's going to kind of congeal into resentment, and that's great, okay? That's key to destroying a church. You really want resentment and bitterness to grow. And then as you kind of add that in, you're going to watch it bubble over. And what you want to bubble it over into is to gossip, okay? You don't yell out loud. What you do in the initial days is you just do little things like roll your eyes when they talk, right? Or when that person says something, you're like, here we go. You know, or they point out that person that has what you want, just go like, okay. And then after a while, you want to lean over to somebody else and be like, well, you know what? I heard she does this, or you know what? I heard he's a liar. She steals money from her office, I bet. Right? And you just want to kind of slowly talk about, well, around here, you know, these people are this, and you just kind of want to sow gossip into it, because gossip is cancer in the church, and it'll slowly kill it, right? So if you want to do this, that's what you do. It starts with ambition, and then you look for slights, and then you accuse motives. And then you attack those motives. And then you marshal people to your side against that side, and you slowly rip the church apart. It's happened here in DC. Churches split, churches divide. Happens all the time, happens throughout history. I remember when I first started ministry, listening to Charles Stanley talk about becoming a pastor. And he talked about this very thing. Selfish ambition became jealousy, became resentment, became bitterness, became whispering, became factions. And then at one point he was leading a church meeting, and one of the guys walked up on stage and hit him in the face. I kid you not. Like, I'm a young pastor listening to this. I'm like, what? This dude hit him. Little Andy Stanley, this big, comes flying out after the guy. I mean, it was crazy. And you're like, but that happens, right? But what's the root of it all? The root of it's inside of you. I want more me. I want less you. Now, I know some of you hear this and you're like, wait a minute, isn't ambition good? Shouldn't we want ambition? Isn't ambition a great thing? Isn't ambition the cornerstone of Washington, D.C.? Well, listen to me. According to James, no, because he's talking about a selfish ambition. Should you have a drive to succeed? Yeah, but what's the end goal? Take it out of you for a minute. What do you like? Like in your music. Do you like that person that's creating good music because they love music? They love beauty. They love tension and resolve, and they want to share that beauty. Or do you want that person that just wants to be famous and music is a means to an end? Does that excite you? That person who holds on to slights and bitterness, all their music's filled with resentment, right? Does that get it to you? Or what about acting? Do you love the person that just loves to act? They love to embody a character. They love to share that with you. They like to tell you a story, and they'll go to great lengths to tell that story well. Or do you love that person who just wants to be famous And whatever story they're in is just a means to an end. Whatever story they're telling doesn't even matter. What they're trying to do is just advance themselves. Or politically. Do you love that person that really believes this is going to help people? So I'm going to work hard to write this bill. I'm going to work hard on this policy. I'm going to try to present it in a winsome way because I really think it'll help society. Or do you want that person that, like, the issue's not really the issue. I just want to be in charge. I just want to be the person driving. Which is exciting for you. Are you just like, man, I love selfishness. It's so great. I'm looking for that. Whenever I see someone that's just advancing, just elbowing people out of the way, I'm like, I love that guy. I want to get to know her. She seems neat. Just the way she kind of shivs people on her way to the top. That is so special. No. James will say that's demonic. That's demonic. And here's what's interesting. He says you don't have because you don't ask. He says in all this manipulation, there's no supplication. You know you're in trouble. When you're not even praying for an issue, you're just fighting to get to the top. And then he says, and then when you do ask, you ask for wrong motives to spend it on your own passions. He says you're praying for God to bless the advancement of you. And then James will assess it. He says in verse 4, you adulterous people, which again is very James. This guy is not afraid to come real at you, right? But I love the way he says it. I read a quote just today. It says, if all your prayers were answered, would it change the world or just your world? If all your prayers are just about you and advancing you, man, God's exposing your heart. And then here's what James does when he's going to move to the root of the problem now. The problem is not the external problem. The problem's our internal problem. The problem's not our quarrels. The problem's our selfish ambition. And he says the root of that problem, and here's what's interesting. You would think you would say, hey, why are we all fighting? It's because we're all being selfish. Y'all just need to love each other. Y'all get along. Y'all be nice. But he doesn't do that. He actually leaves the conversation between you and me if you and me are fighting. He says, you know what your real problem is? Your real problem is not interpersonal. Your real problem is theological. Your real problem is with God. The reason you're fighting with each other is because you're an adulteress, is what he says. You're a cheater. And you go, what do you mean by that? Well, he's grabbing Old Testament imagery. Isaiah 54 says, your maker is your husband, talking to the people of God. God wants to love you like a husband loves a wife. Jeremiah 3, like a woman who's unfaithful to her husband, you've been unfaithful to me, O Israel, is what God says. All through the Old Testament, God uses this imagery. I'm like a husband who wants to love his wife, and he wants his wife to love him back. And so he says the problem with the church is when you get people who come to church and they say, I love God, but what they're really here to do is advance themselves. They say, man, I want to serve God, but what I'm really doing is I'm trying to get myself to the top of the heap. How do I get more likes? How do I get more follows? How do I get more authority? How do I get more in charge? What do I need to use? Who do I need to move? What do I need to manipulate? Who do I need to kill? How do I get myself up front? He said that is adultery because I want you to love me, and what you're doing is you're loving you. But you're asking me to marshal heaven's resources for your earthly pursuits? You're trying to use my church to advance you? That's what I tell young pastors all the time. You be careful. There's some people that want to be on the stage because they want to serve people. There's some people that want to be on the stage because they want the spotlight. They don't want to serve you. They want to use you. And one of the greatest things you can do as a pastor is not give a wolf access to the sheep. But even though you're like, oh, the wolf really wanted those sheep. And you're like, yeah, but your job is to say no. If you're here to use people, I can't elevate you. I need to elevate the servants. And if you're looking for leadership out of selfish ambition, I can't serve you because you're cheating on the God we're serving. If you're saying, I want to worship you, but you're chasing popularity, that's weird. Man, I belong to Jesus, but I keep sliding into the DMs of notoriety? That's strange. Man, I am a Christian. I serve Christ, but I'm just really trying to hook up with money. Right? God says, hey, that's adultery. You're an adulterous person. He says, don't you know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Now, he's not saying you can't have non-Christian friends. He's talking about a worldly system. A worldly mentality is, I got to build my kingdom for my power, for my glory. The Christian one says, no, I'm ditching that. I'm building his kingdom with his power for his glory. And you don't want to come in his house and try to build your kingdom. That's weird. It plays strange. And some people, when they dislike Christianity, it's because of that. This guy keeps putting God's name in his mouth, but it looks like he's building his kingdom. That's a dangerous thing. The world doesn't like that. It's adultery. And God doesn't like it. He says in verse 5, or do you suppose that it's with no purpose that Scripture says he yearns jealousy over the Spirit he made to dwell in us? He's saying don't be an adulterous wife because God's jealous for you. Now, it's interesting. Some people trip up over that. I remember I heard Oprah in an interview was talking about why she walked away from faith in Jesus for a long time. And she said, I used to go to church, and then I remember hearing a sermon where the pastor said, God is a jealous God. And she said, I just thought that sounded so small, so insecure. Like God is jealous for you, like he's that guy that like follows you. No. And she said, that seemed so small, so I had to leave it. And the tragedy of that is a misunderstanding of what he means here. He's not talking about the insecurity of God. He's saying God wants you. He's jealous for you, saying he wants you just for himself. That's not wrong to feel that way. There's a healthy version of this, and this is talking about a healthy way. It's not wrong for a woman to ask her husband to not date other women. That's not small. That's not like, okay, well, if you're insecure or whatever. No, that's, you made a covenant. I promise to love you. So she's not being insecure to say, so stop calling this girl, right? Say my name. Like that, it's okay for her to say that, right? And same with a guy. It's okay if he's married to say to his wife, I don't want any other guy to have you but me. Now, yes, there's an unhealthy, broken, crazy version of that, but that's not God. God has a healthy version of, man, I want you to love me and I love you. But if you are saying you love me, but really what you're just chasing is self-advancement, he says that's what the devil does. Because when you start to advance you, it's contra over us, and you begin to bite, elbow, kick, and you begin to resent. And some of you, your daily thoughts are filled with resentment for coworkers because they got and I didn't get. They're lifting and I'm falling. And your whole world is kind of filled with a toxic nature of that. And it's not supposed to be like that. And it can't be like that in here, right? We're meant to run from that. Now, here's the crazy thing. Let's turn the corner because this sermon's real depressing. This part's scary because what James is doing right now is he's pushing us to confess, right? You're an adulterous person. You say you love God, but you love you. You say you're about his purposes, but you're pushing you. He's doing that, and what he's trying to get you to do is agree. But it's interesting, when people press people to confess, a lot of times we back up. We don't want to admit it. We don't want to admit I'm being selfish. We don't want to admit I'm being insecure. We don't want to admit that. Why? Because in our culture today, the minute you admit fault, what we say in the world is, aha, I knew it. You sicken me. You have hurt us. You have wounded us. You are banished. Get out. You are canceled. You are tossed out. Get out of my sight. You are not worthy to look upon. And so we realize I can't confess weakness because these people will eat me alive. I can't confess sin because that'll diminish me more. I can't confess that I'm an adulteress. They'll cast me out. But here's the beautiful thing. In the biblical terms, confession never leads to your destruction. Confession is the key to your redemption. James is pushing you to admit, not so he can destroy you, but so that he can exalt you. Because God opposes the proud. He has to. But he gives grace to the humble, right? He's pushing for confession, not for destruction, but for redemption, so I can lift you up. That's what I love about verse 6. It's so different from our culture. He says, you're an adulterous person. And then in verse 6, he says, but he gives more grace. More than your insecurity, more than the weird things you say, more than the awkward way you kind of bitterly hold on to resentment against others. He has more grace for that. He has more healing than you have brokenness. He has more grace than you have insecurity. He has more love than you have hate. And so the remedy is not to back away from him, it's to move towards him. The remedy is not to hide, it's to confess. It's because he has to oppose the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. We talked about that as we were launching this church all the time with our team. It is so dangerous for a church to be proud. And so I encourage my team, we will not be proud people. We will not be arrogant. If our church grows, we won't be like, yeah, that's because our name is Passion City. Like, we're not going to be that. Because as soon as you do that, God not only can't bless you, This text says he has to walk around the other side and oppose you. Not only will he not bless you, he'll step around and oppose you. And who wants to build a church? You're like, yeah, man, we're building a church that God opposes. God is just against it. But you know what? We're going to keep going because we have a different power, an earthly, unspiritual, demonic power, some might say. We're not going to do that. So he opposes the proud. I don't want to hear it. But he gives grace to the humble. He puts his God power underneath and behind the humble person, and he exalts. And that's the kind of power we want. Not one that says, well, it's because they got the best whatever. It's because their drummer rocks. Well, it's because they got this. No, man, no. It's because the grace of God is working in a human life. And so the key is confession. So I remember for me, here's where, if I can give my own personal example. When I was first starting to preach a lot, it was a weird thing. I would get really nervous before sermons. I'd get really anxious. And I usually thought it was because I wasn't prepared enough, or it's because it was who is in the crowd. It's important that I impress that person. It's important that they like me. It's important that you approve me. And I would get real nervous about, do I know this text? And I would focus all that nervous energy on trying to get the words just right, trying to get the sermon just right. And then I remember one day I was before a sermon, I'm freaking out, and I stopped and was like, why am I so anxious? And I just started questioning my heart. Step away from the sermon for a minute. Why is my heart so anxious? And I realized, is it because I'm worried God won't be glorified? Is that my biggest concern? I'm just so scared if I don't say the right words, God won't get glorified and Jesus won't be known and you'll all go to hell and it'll be my fault. Like, is that what I think? I'm like, no, actually, I don't think that at all. Like, God is going to do his work, and he spoke through a donkey in the Old Testament. He can speak through me. He can use powerful messages through weak people. And I was like, then where's all the anxiety coming from? Like, am I worried the word of God's going to fail? Like, no, I'm not worried that God won't be glorified. I'm worried that I won't be glorified. And that's where it got me. All this anxiety is coming from, I want you to think I'm funny. I want you to think I'm wise. I want you to think I'm smart. I want you to think I'm cool. I want you to make me popular. I want you to exalt me. I want to see me lifted up. And then the mental picture I got in my head is of a spotlight on a stage. And the goal of a sermon is to put Jesus in the spotlight. And I just got this picture of Jesus in the spotlight and me going, and just trying to, and I'm like, it's so ridiculous. I don't want to do that. Life is too short. And at the end of the day, you don't need me. None of you woke up this week and were like, man, this week is hard. I just need some more Ben Stewart. I need his voice. No one thought that. But you needed more of God. You needed more of him. And no one at your office woke up and needed more of you. No one in this world woke up and were like, if Gina would just speak, no one was looking for you. But they need God. And the more you try to advance you, it's not going to impress anybody, and it won't have the sin of heaven on it. It won't. But the more you let your little kingdom fall, the more you confess it. I'm an adulterous person. I'm trying to step into the spotlight. The more you confess that, God doesn't cast you out, you sicken me. He moves towards you and says, I want to empower you. So admit it. Admit that we have this broken heart in us, but don't lose hope, because God loves to bless the humble. And that's where the rest of this goes. In verse 7 and then verse 10, he basically says the same thing. Submit yourself to God. And then in verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord. And then all in the middle of that, he's just explaining how to do that. He says, submit yourself to God. Put yourself under him. It was like what Bethany was talking about. I had my plan. I was trying to work. And then finally I was like, you know what, Lord, you have your plan. And that doesn't mean I don't do anything, but it means I stop trying to control and manipulate you and everybody else. Let me just do good work. Let me do what's in front of me well and trust you, God, with determining my course. I'm going to submit myself to the authority of God. I'm going to resist the devil. And the devil, remember, that word diabolos means to thrust through. It comes from the Old Testament word Satan, which means adversary, one who likes to rip apart. So you need to know that if there's a desire in me that wants to elevate over somebody else, I'm trying to rip apart a community God's trying to build. I'm trying to tear apart a family that God's trying to knit together. I don't want to be an ungodly person in a godly space. So I need to resist that motive. That impulse to gossip, no, I'm going to kill that. It's interesting. I remember talking with a young man once that I told him, you should be a Bible study leader. He was humble, loved the Lord, wanted to study the Bible, wanted to teach it. And I told him, hey man, you should be a Bible study leader in our community. And he was like, man, I know I just can't do it. I'm like, why? And he's like, because I know there's this desire in me to be noticed and to be liked, and I'm just scared of that motive. And I was like, bro, then kill the motive. Don't kill the Bible study. You're going to not help people know God because you're worried about being arrogant. Kill the arrogance, but don't kill the Bible study. And I'll meet people that come to a church and they're like, man, I just got sideways with this person, or this person and I, where I was sort of interested in this person. They did this over here. And so you know what? I'm just out. I'm bouncing. I'm gone. You're like, man, don't kill the community because of a misunderstanding, right? Kill the misunderstanding. Kill the toxic impulse. Resist the devil. He'll flee from you. You got bigger power behind you than he got. Draw near to God, and he'll draw near to you. That's what the early church used to do in baptism. And we've talked about this. I loved the way they did baptism. I love the way we do it. So it was pretty awesome. Like, you know, the system's not right or wrong, but I love the way they did it, because before they would step into the water, they would turn away from it for a second, because they knew the devil used to be the controlling power in my life. He's not anymore. So before they got into that water, they would turn their back and say, I renounce you, Satan, and all your pump. Which I love that they use the word pump. You're like, what is that about? They're like, all your drama, I'm done with it. And then they would turn and they would enter the water. And the picture of entering the water is I'm united with the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit and God's community, and I'm walking in a new life. I'm resisting you. I don't want that in my heart. And I'm drawing near to you. I'm moving towards you. And then he says, cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify you hearts, you double-minded. He's using priestly image of the Old Testament. Whenever a priest would come to serve God, they would always wash their hands. That's why he says, cleanse your hands. And then God would tell him, it's not just about the externals. That's a picture of you need to confess in your heart. What I love about that is the priests in the Old Testament, they didn't pretend they were holy. God told him, before you come and serve in my house, you have to wash your hands. What's the implication? It's a symbol of your admission, I'm dirty. That's why we say it all the time in here. You're a mess. You're broken. You're dirty. It's not to beat you up like, hey, you shouldn't shame people. No, like that's where it starts. That's where humility begins. I walk in like, I'm a mess. Hi, mess. My name's Bob. You know, like we start there, but then we come in. Why? Because we're a mess, but we're invited. We're broken, but there's redemption for those who admit it. So I wash my hands. I cleanse my heart. For me, I tell young guys in sermon preparation, 50% of it is mortification. Mortification is killing. I know when I come to write a sermon, so many of my motives are wrong. And so I just go, Lord, I know if I don't talk about that broken part of my heart, my whole sifting criteria of what I say or don't say will be built on whether or not these people like me. And so I just need to take that motive out. I need to set it before you, and I need to pull out a gun and just put it down. Put it down. Boom. Like I need to kill that motivation. Take it out of my heart. And some of us, when you walk into an office, you haven't even thought about the work of your office. All you think about is those interpersonal dynamics. And you say, you know what? That person's being too loud does not necessitate me gossiping. That gossip comes out of here. It comes out of insecurity that God's not going to advance me in my life. It comes out of insecurity that God won't control my story. So Lord, I need to cleanse my hands. I need to purify my heart. I need to pull this selfishness out before you, and I need to take it out back and put it down, right? And get it out of my heart. Verse 9, he says, be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. You don't see that one on many coffee mugs. But he's using prophet imagery in the Old Testament. That's what God would tell the prophets. Hey, if you know there's something broken, or the prophets, through the prophets, say, if there's something broken in your heart, you don't act like you're fine. You confess it though. You come out and say, hey, this is a part of my heart. It's a mess. And when you confess it, then you repent, and the prophets always end happy, because though your joy may turn to gloom, in verse 10, but if you humble yourselves before the Lord, he'll exalt you. He loves to lift the humble. So I remember for me, when I first got into ministry, I left a college that the way that college kind of prepared you as a young person is, you know, when you graduate from here, you'll take over the world. Like you're the smartest people on the planet. So they kind of like built, it was meant to build you up, but it also put this insecurity of you. When you step out into the world, you should take over. And I remember when I first stepped out into ministry, I sort of had that in my mind. And I stepped in as a youth pastor. And I remember I got a group of about 4 students and 6 adults that by the end of it, I remember I had grown to 0 adults and 1 student. And I remember sitting there at this Bible study with little Austin Baldridge, just me and him. And I was so mad. And after a while, I was like, why am I so mad? I was like, I'm mad because Austin isn't 100 people. He's just one person. Like, is that about Austin? You're like, no, it's about my heart. And I remember I felt like God pressed into me with that same thing he'd asked Peter. Peter, do you love me? And I felt like he was like, Ben, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, then feed my sheep. One sheep, Austin. And what God convicted me in my heart at that moment was I didn't love Austin. I wanted to use Austin and his friends to elevate me. And God exposed a selfishness in me. He says, do you see it? That's why I can't give you more, because you'll use my sheep instead of love them. We have to kill that. And something broke in me that day. Ministry is not about self-exaltation. It's about serving and loving others. And it's not just ministry. It's the same with art. It's the same with business. It's the same with government. God gifted you so you could help us. God put ideas in your mind for the common good. God gave you skill sets to make the world a better place for us. You don't need selfish ambition to drive you in your goal. That's a toxic version. You do need to work hard, but for God's glory and our good. You write music for God's glory to encourage us, we'll listen to it. You write policies for God's glory and our good, you'll have a hearing. You do business in a way that helps humanity flourish, God will bless that. But selfish ambition, you don't need it. And so I tell you what, I had to bury that. All these desires to be something in ministry. And you know what the craziest thing happened is? I just went and started studying the Word of God and teaching little Austin. And then Austin brought a friend. They brought some friends. Suddenly I had a ministry of 15 people. Man. So I started a brand, started printing my own shirts with my face on it. No, I'm just kidding. No, you just keep serving, man. And what happened was the craziest thing. This one youth pastor asked me if I'd come speak to his kids. I was like, yeah, I'll do that. So I spoke to his kids. And someone was in that room that said, hey, can you speak at this deal? That's a citywide thing. I'm like, yeah, sure. So I spoke at that thing. And then while I was there, another guy said, hey, can you come speak at the singles thing in Houston? I'm like, yeah, sure. So I spoke at that thing. He's like, hey, will you be our weekly guy that teaches at the singles thing? And I remember it was the weirdest thing. I was sitting in the parking lot of that church, and it was one of the biggest things going in Houston. And I sat in the parking lot before I went in there, and I was like, you know what's crazy? Me of 5 years ago would have done anything to be in this position now. The me right now doesn't care. Honestly and sincerely doesn't care. I care about these people and I want them to know God, but I don't care about the exaltation of Ben. And I started crying, kind of embarrassing. I was glad I was by myself. Because I realized God had healed my heart. Not me, I didn't fix it, but I confessed it. I was an adulterous person, trying to use you to elevate me. And when you confess that and humble yourself, he exalts in due time. He lifts in due time. He's going to use you. He's going to bless you. And he's going to bless us through you.